Hello and welcome to the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. Today's guest has been a counselor and teacher for over 20 years, helping people deal with and overcome anxiety disorders. He is the author of many books, including his newest, Why You Feel the Way You Do, Understand and Heal the Source of Stressful Emotions. Welcome to the show, Reneau Peurifoy.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a joy to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in. Of all the over 600 episodes I've done, I've never done a deep dive on emotions, understanding emotions, and all of your books, all of your work really revolve around these things. A lot of people are suffering from anxiety and different stressful emotional states. So I'm just excited about this. I'm excited to do a deep dive into your work. And I'd love for you to just tell us a little about your background, how you got into this and the work you do. Because you said at the beginning, there's a lot of nonsense when it comes around emotions. And so you go deep into like the origins, and I'm excited for the show.
Yeah, well, I've been interested in behavior ever since I was a kid. And both my parents came from farming backgrounds, and we only had about half an acre, but I raised chickens and rabbits, and we had geese and dogs and cats, and and I would train them, even the laying hens, you would train them to get up on little boxes and stuff. So just been interested in that all my life. And my sophomore year, they referred to me as Mr. Spock because I was interested in this type of stuff, and I was a science geek. So it was kind of natural to move into that. And I switched in fact, my major in biology was animal behavior. And then I switched from that to human behavior when I became a counselor. And of course, I joked that was a step down, but because animals are so easy to understand. Well, people are too. Once you kind of figure out, they're good at masking stuff. Where animals are just there. What you see is what you got.
Right. And so when you went through these studies, you've written a lot of books. A lot of them are, anxiety and anger and emotions. But I think with your newest book, let's start there, and then we'll talk about like the origin of emotions, understanding them, how we can deal with them, and moving into all that type of just information that can be helpful for people.
Well, emotions are part of the very old part of your brain, and that's why we share them all the other mammals. And they're basically what's called in neuroscience an affect. And affects cause you to want to get up and do something. They're a driver. And there are like three levels. The first level would what we call sensory affects, things like heat, cold, pressure. If you're cold, you want to get warm, and the hotter you are, the more you want to get cold. If you're sitting too long in one position, that pressure makes you want to move around. And the next level up would be what they call homeostatic affects, and that's just a fancy word for keeping balance in your body. Hunger and thirst and are probably the two most common ones. So when I'm thirsty, the thirstier I get, the more I want to get something to drink. The hungrier I have, the more I'm motivated to get something to eat. So again, they're drivers. And so emotions are the level up on top of that. And there are 7 basic emotions. One of the most interesting ones for me is something called seeking. And if you watch any baby, whether it's a mammal or human baby, they want to explore their environment. They get out there, they start licking everything, chewing on everything, touching everything. And it's a drive to seek out in your environment what's out there. Are there good things? Are there bad things? What is there? You see that if you go to a new situation, if you're going into a new auditorium, the first thing you do, or a doctor's office or whatever, is you check everything out. And it's just an inborn kind of a pressure to want to know what's out there. And it drives a lot of what causes people to want to learn new things and stuff. Again, all of these things can be suppressed depending upon your upbringing and stuff. But in a normal upbringing, that's part of who we are. Another interesting one is something called the play circuit. And you can take rats and you can cut off the top part of the brain, the thinking part, and they still want to play. It's a very important one for mammals and for humans, because it's how we learn social limits. If you ever worked with little kids, at some point in time they do something they're not supposed to, and that's when you say, hey, in fact, I was working with my 3.5-year-old granddaughter this morning, and she started spitting at, hey, and so she cried a little bit, that she realized that that's something you don't do, right? And even as adults, we like to play. It's a driver inside of ourselves, something that we have a need for. And again, all of these can be suppressed, and changed depending upon your experiences. Then, lust is another one. And of course, we all understand that one. Puberty, that becomes activated. Then there's 2 fear circuits, which is interesting. One is danger. And the other one in infants, we call it separation anxiety. And it's why we miss people when they're gone. And it's countered with what's called a caring circuit. And so like in mammals, the baby cries and then the parent responds to that and wants to somehow take care of it. And the same thing with humans, right? And that's why the sound of a baby crying, that pitch, really causes an emotional, a gut emotional response in adults. If you're ever at the fair or something and you watch some kid fall down, cry, look at all the other kids. They immediately look with intent awareness, what's going on? And there's this concern in their eyes, right? And that's part of what bonds us to other people, and that's also part of what causes us to miss them. And then anger is, of course, the final circuit. And all of these are just designed to help us meet needs, to identify threats, and to prevent loss. And when you think of emotions, that's essentially what they're about. They're about meeting needs, or perceived needs, I should say that, because sometimes what we think is a need or our perception of that cannot be accurate, to prevent loss and to avoid threats and to manage threats. In fact, it's interesting when you look at anger and fear, they're actually the flip side of the coin. Depending upon how you assess the threat, you will have one or the other reaction, or sometimes a mixture. If the threat is manageable, I'm going to get some kind of anger. It might just be irritation, but I'm going to take it out. I'm going to get rid of that threat. If the threat is unmanageable, then I want to get away from it. So if it's a little chihuahua barking at me, hey, get away from here, If it's a big bear coming at me, then I'm going to go the other direction, right? And if you understand emotions in that sense, they make a lot of sense, because in counseling, you work backwards. If somebody has a lot of anger, then you want to identify what's the threat. Threat is the basis. Same thing with anxieties. And again, there can be physical part of it as well, but also from a mental side of it, it would be some kind of a threat going on. And so once you start to identify those things, then that's what you manage. And of course, the problem with people is we develop belief systems and perceptions of the world that are not necessarily the most accurate. In fact, when you think about the brain, you are unconscious most of the day. What you are aware, there's so much stuff going on an unconscious level. It's like you've got these thousands of workers working. You're the manager up here kind of focusing on one little report. But just the simple act of walking, you're judging distance, you're looking out for danger. Your brain is doing all kinds of things that you're just totally unaware of because you're busy listening to some music or thinking about what you're going to have for lunch or something of that nature. And these associations that you acquire during your lifetime have a lot to do with these emotional responses you have. That's why sometimes you feel things and you wonder, where'd that come from? Or maybe you get hunches about people. And a lot of times it's because of past associations that you've had about things, and the fact that we read people like a book. That nonverbal communication we have, just like a dog or a cat can read people, we do that too. We suppress a lot of that sometimes because we become so used to using verbal communication as our main way of communicating, but we still pick up on all kinds of things with your body language, your tone of voice. The simple example I use is the simple phrase, I love you. I can say it 3 different ways. I love you. I love you. Hey, love you, guy. You know what each one of those means without me having to explain it, because it's wired into us on that emotional associative level. And that's why they sometimes seem so mysterious to people, is because these associations are very unconscious. And when you start to change negative patterns, part of what you got to do is come up with a way of becoming conscious of some of those things that are driving those emotions, behaviors that you've been unaware of. And so what I do is I'll tend to have people put labels on them, because when you label something, it gives you a way to think about it. So a simple example would be somebody maybe grew up in a negative background where when they tried to express themselves, they got stomped on, right? So they learned that conflict is dangerous. Now, depending upon how they're wired, they might become a fighter, or they may go into the background and just learn, I become passive when I'm in conflict. Now, as an adult, they're in a situation where friends are suggesting things to them that they don't agree with, but they just go along with it, right? I'm at a restaurant, I want to order this, but they say, no, you shouldn't order that, you should order this. And so I go along with it because I've learned to avoid conflict at that unconscious level. It's dangerous. And so later on, I'm wondering, why did I behave that way? Well, it's because at that unconscious associative level, conflict is dangerous. And so once I identify that and I start practicing the opposite behavior, speaking up and the behavior I want to start doing, then eventually those associations will change. And so you can change them. It takes time. It's kind of like when you're working with a phobia or something. Because so much of this stuff is unconscious, it takes time to rewire, if you will, that association within your brain. And that's one of the problems with a lot of self-help books is we use this brain, this computer model a lot, and we talk about deleting the program or rewriting the program. And we are not computers. We are organic beings. And so changing associations is like developing a muscle. It takes time to develop and to get it strengthened, or to weaken it by not using it, like when you're in a cast or something and it atrophies. Never goes away completely. And that's the other thing that sometimes bugs people, is occasionally these old associations will get triggered, especially when you're sick, hungry, tired, or under stress. And that's the big thing. And everybody's experienced that, right? You got the cold or the flu, or you're under a lot of stress. And some of those old patterns that you thought you'd done away with, they creep up again. And that's okay. It just means that, it's a signal that you're sick and retired, which is another big soapbox I like to get on, because people often are unaware of when stress is affecting them, right? Mm. And so I like to tell people, you need to have some stress indicators. Everybody does something when they're feeling stressed. And the more you can identify what those things are that you say or do, then those become like little light bulbs on your car dashboard that tell you, stress is indicating is affecting you. So you need to take some action to it. In our culture, a lot of people have this mentality that, I can make my body do anything I want to. It's just mind over matter, right? And they watch movies. They see the guy who's been shot. He's been thrown out of the airplane. He's been run over a couple times, beat up, yet he's still trucking along, right? In real life, that doesn't happen. Stress will affect you, and it affects your ability to think clearly, and it will cause these negative emotional responses from the past to frequently come up again. And so just being aware of that your body is a machine with a limited supply of energy. And some days my tank is full and some days it's half empty. And so just knowing that and then compensating for it. So if I know I'm under stress, I need to decide, where am I going to put that energy, and let the other stuff slide until the time when I've got a full tank again.
Wow. Well, you brought up a lot of great concepts and teaching points already. I immediately begin to think about just how beliefs and memories are formed, right? And it's like this emotional trigger, right? So if you see a yellow truck go down the street, you don't care about yellow trucks.
Unless you've been hit by one.
Yeah, you get hit by one, or I use the example of your dog got run over. So because that emotional state is so high, do you know from your research, what I've thought and believed is that it like creates this entrenched circuit in your brain, right? That emotion is what really, wires that brain together, that trauma or that experience. Because if there's no emotional charge, then it's going to go in the memory bank and it's like, it's just another day. But if it's super emotionally charged, then that pattern is going to repeat itself because you've formed meaning to it. Right. And so it sounds like what you're suggesting is the first thing is getting to the root. Once you have that understanding of where that belief come from, or that unconscious pattern that you're running, whether it's anxiety or a phobia or stress, like if somebody's so anxious, it's like finding those triggers, going back to like the original trigger.
You don't necessarily have to go back to the original one, because sometimes you don't know, because sometimes they happen so young or whatever reason you don't remember it. But let me back up, because
sorry to cut you off, or is it like death by 1,000 cuts? So it's not like, one thing. It's like a repeated
it could be, especially if it's a childhood thing, right? But your brain uses emotions to sort information. And that's a key thing, is that your memories will have an emotional tag on them. And memories that are important will have a stronger emotional tag than those that aren't. So this is why book learning is not as important as experiential learning. And that's why we are experiential beings. I can read several books about driving a car, and I can understand all the concepts about driving a car, but until I get behind the wheel and I start doing things, but that didn't work. Oh, this feels good. Those now will tag that information with an emotional tag of either positive or negative, which then the subconscious will use to later on when you're driving and you're not even thinking about it, right? And that's true for all the other things in your life. Is all this information? It's kind of a way that in computer language they talk about indexing information. Emotions are a way that the brain uses to index information to important, unimportant, something that's going to take care of a need, something that's a threat. And I think that's how I understand it, and that seems to be what research has been pointing to.
Yeah, I like that distinction. And you talk about what generates emotions, or where they come from. I'd be curious about that, because they seem like spontaneous, right? And then I'm curious about, like, when you work with anger, the emotion comes up, and my education or experiences through like meditation or something is learning to nip it in the butt. It's like, whoa, like I'm feeling anger, and rather than just responding and taking an action, taking a step back to notice it. So I'm curious, yeah, if you know where the origin point of emotion comes, because even it can be something stupid and we just feel the way we do,
Well,
right?
it comes from the associations that have been made in your brain as to
Mhm.
what's a threat, what's not a threat. In the case of anger, what's a threat? And again, it depends upon your worldview. You know, a threat may be loss of status. It might be, you know, failing to do certain things along with just real actual threats. You know, like a person coming at you with a spear or something. And I think the things with anger, it's useful to identify, okay, I'm feeling angry. When you do anger management, the first step is, yes, stop and calm down. But then the next step is, okay, where'd that come from? How am I feeling threatened? And just asking the question most of the time will give you the answer. And then what do I do about that threat is, I think, the next step. So in anger management, it's, you know, taking time to identify what the threat is. Is it real or is it imagined? Is it because of some irrational belief I have, or is it an actual threat that I need to deal with? And then taking action. If it's a real threat, then coming up with a plan. If it's something because of my belief systems, then I need to maybe address that either through re-examining some of those belief systems about who I am or the world, or, you know, all that type of stuff. And then practicing, you know, developing a more healthy belief system. That's a lot of what you do in therapy with people. So,
Right. And when you speak about habitual thinking, I
mhm,
remember going to Dr. Joe Dispenza's workshops and seminars, and he was just saying that we have on average 70 to 90,000 thoughts a day,
mhm,
and most of them are repeated. And I always thought how interesting it would be if you could have your thoughts laid out in front of you, right?
mhm,
And you could read them each day, and we could really understand our worldview at that point, right? It's like, holy, I keep thinking about
yeah,
this, this, and this. And a lot of them are fear-based, right? Because they come out of worry, they come out of fear. So you perpetuate them. And then it shows in your work. I'm curious if it's the same thing. It creates a negative emotional state. If I keep thinking about the worst case scenario, I'm not going to be thinking positively, right? But our
mm,
conscious mind is assessing threats so we can exist in the world.
yeah,
However, these patterns are running unconsciously, and then it'll generate an emotional state. And
yeah,
so now you're going around the day in fear and anxiety rather than joy, peace, and contentment and happiness.
yeah. Well, and again, let me say first of all that you know, 78% of all statistics are made up at the time. Uh, so I tend to always, you know, when people come up with these numbers like this, you know, take them with a
Yeah.
grain of salt. You know,
Yeah.
there's not a lot of actual hard evidence for that. They're kind of just theoretical things that people throw out, but they give you a kind of a framework. You know, most of your thoughts that you have during the day, you don't even remember. They're not that important. I mean, if you really stop and think about all the little things that are coming through your brain at a particular, you know, over the last 5 minutes or so, a lot of it's just stuff floating in and out. You know, uh, but to get back to what you were saying about, you know, your thoughts being fear based, it depends upon your worldview. You know, some people. I mean, if you are growing up in some of the war torn areas of our world today, yeah, a lot of your thinking is going to be fear based, right? If you grew up in a fairly positive environment where there's not a lot of major threats, you're probably going to have a more positive worldview, and you won't have that many fear thoughts. So again, it really depends upon the individual and your experience. And again, some of that can change. You know, you can change that over time, but it does take practice. I don't know if that answers where you're going with it.
Oh yeah, no, I appreciate those distinctions.
Yeah,
Well, it's interesting because I'm just reflecting on my own childhood
yeah.
and my point of view. I think that definitely plays a role in it. I'm just curious when in your work, when you talk about the habitual thinking patterns that generate negative emotions, if that was in line with what I was thinking.
Well, it is. I mean, the brain takes a lot of shortcuts, and that's good because if you had to think in detail about everything, you'd be paralyzed most of your life. So one of the more common shortcuts is should must thinking, things that I should or must or have to do.
Hmm.
And we get these generalizations about, this is the best thing to do, this is the way I should do that. And some people will make those very rigid rules. Okay. And in fact, when you work with anxiety disorders, one of the characteristics of them is they have a lot of rigid should must rules about the way things have to be or should be. And so I like to change that to, there's really nothing in the world that you have to do. And of course, people object to that and they'll say, well, you got to pay taxes. No, you don't. Or when I was teaching school, and students would say, well, you gotta show up for the class. I say, no, just stay home and relax. No, but then I'd flunk. Well, okay, so why are you coming to school? Because I want to graduate. I want to get a better job and blah, blah, blah. So you're choosing to come to school because of the reward. And so what I try to get people to do is change should must thinking into choice. I'm doing things because I prefer, I want, or I would like, not because I have to. I don't have to be on time. I like to be on time. Now, when you do a lot of should must thinking, and again, this comes from childhood. When you teach kids, you say you have to brush your teeth, you have to do this, blah, blah, blah. So you learn all these rules, right? And if you keep thinking in those terms, it's like this invisible adult is following you around saying, you have to do this, you have to do that. And so it gives you kind of a heavy feeling when instead you change it to, I'm choosing to do this. Well, I may choose not to do it sometime, right? But if I have to do it, then there's this pressure on me that I've made inside of myself, as opposed to I like to be on time. Okay, if there's a lot of traffic, I like to be on time, but there's traffic, I may be late. So now I can think about how I'm going to manage it. But if I have to be on time, all I think about, I have to be on time. I have to be on time. I start speeding, I start cursing at people, because I have to be on time. It's a different mentality that you have. So I think that's just one example of a type of distorted thinking that people do. Along with that is something that's called a hidden form of should must thinking called circular why questioning. And you'll see this with people. They'll say, I don't understand why that happened. How could that happen? Why would why would that be like that? And when I would have a client like that, I'd usually ask them, so why do you think that's that way? And they would give me a perfectly reasonable explanation. It's just that within their should must thinking, that's not a possibility. For example, somebody treated me unfair. I don't understand why they act that way. Why would somebody actually, how could people act that way? Well, why do you think somebody might treat you unfair? Well, maybe they were just having a bad day. Maybe they're just a jerk and treat everybody like that way. You have explanations, right? And so once I realize, okay, I need to now decide what am I going to do? If I think that they just had a bad day, then what am I going to do? If I think they're a jerk, treats everybody that way, then there's another set of possibilities. But as long as I'm locked into this, how could they do that? It's like I go in a circle and I'm no longer dealing with reality because I'm kind of, in the circle. It's the absurd example I used to use with people is, that chair should be green and it's brown. I don't understand why that chair is green. It's not green. And I can go in that circle for a long time, but until I just accept that I would like it to be green, but it's not, what am I going to do about it? See, that's a choice, right? But when you get in that circular thinking, which a lot of people do, you see it all the time. After tragedies, you'll see people go into that kind of that loop of, how come, why, and they don't get to what am I going to do about it.
Yeah, and I really love the upgrade for the should must thinking. I've heard of that
Yeah,
before, and I try to apply it in my own life. And because it's very binary, right? It's like you
yeah,
don't have a choice. You're kind of a victim. You know what I mean?
yeah,
You have to, but you're also then going from the negative part of like I don't really want to go to school because I'm waking up this day, or whatever the case, my job because of this and this and
yeah,
this. But you can say, you know what? Well, I want to provide for my family. This is a way
yeah.
that I can earn a living. You know what I mean? I can make this the best day possible. And then it's a much more positive outlook. It's a much more positive worldview. It's a much more positive lens. And
Yeah,
I use the example, it's like an Instagram lens. You know what I mean? You can,
yeah.
whatever lens you want, it's fine. You can switch it to one that feels a little better. And they're both basically true, but one is going to generate a more positive emotional state.
Well, it's empowering, right? With should
Mhm.
must rules, you have no power
Mhm.
because you just have to do it. Right?
Yep.
But if I'm choosing, now I have some choice. I have some power in terms of whether I need to apply that rule in this situation because they're just basically rules, and rules are good to have. They help us navigate the world and relationships and stuff. But just be aware of what your rules are and the fact that you're choosing them.
Yeah, I totally agree. And when you speak about a core response pattern, can you define that and then also go into like how we can change those things? So maybe somebody, suffers from anxiety and walk them through that, or
Yeah.
maybe they suffer from, consistent anger or consistent frustration. And then, I think at the end of that spectrum, what I want to get into a little bit later, but is the idea of like enlightenment is like almost
Mm-hmm.
equanimity or peace, like
Mm-hmm.
contentment, like genuine contentment. You meet a person who's just so content, so at peace. And then they talk about surrender, right? So they
Right.
have no attachment to anything that happens. It could be perceived as bad, right? But they don't perceive it as that. So their emotional state remains the same, which I think is a level of mastery I'd love to get to one day because I'm super attached to the results. It seems, I'm like, oh, this is bad, this is good. And then I kind of catch it and try to coach myself into a more positive state. But I feel like it would be very empowering to
Yeah.
experience contentment, gratitude, surrender more than attaching to all these results that create, stressful emotional states.
Hmm. Well, let me deal with the core response patterns first,
Okay.
and then because you really get into what I deal with in the back of the book, which is the three things that create happiness in life. Uh, but core response patterns are something that usually develop over time, and I've already mentioned one, the idea that conflict is dangerous. So that kind of a core response pattern has developed over again that child's lifehood, and understand that kids have different wiring, right? There was a study in Dunedin in New Zealand that's still going on. It started back in the 70s, and they took every baby that was born for 1 year and they started studying them. They did, sociological, physical, psychological. When MRIs and genetic stuff came out, they started doing those studies. So they've been studying them now for 50 years. And at age 3.5, they found they fell into five groups that have been very consistent throughout their lifetime. You had your what they call your courageous kids. I call them the evil Knievel kids, right? The ones that, as adults, become hang gliders and all that, extreme sports stuff, or entrepreneurs, that type of stuff. Then you have your well-adjusted kids, which is the big group. There's like about 40%, and they're just, they meet the world and they're even keel and they take reasonable risk and that type of stuff. Then you have your what they called your shy kids. And they're the ones that hang back a little bit. They grow up and they do fine. It's just they tend to not be as out front as the well-adjusted kids. Those three groups, unless they had some really negative background, turned out fine in life. Then the other two groups were the extremely shy kids, and if they were in a very encouraging family, they would come out okay. But they were the ones that were most at risk to have some problems later on. And then the ones that were most at risk were the ones that were they called under controlled. In fact, they found that teaching kids to control themselves was the best thing you could do to ensure success as adults.
Hmm.
Uh, the old marshmallow test, right? If you wait for 5 minutes, I'll give you a second marshmallow. And the kids that just gobble it up right away, those are the under controlled ones, and the ones that could do the delayed gratification and control those impulses, they tend to do that. That served them well later in life as they met with all of the problems that we encounter. So personality has a role as to how these core response patterns develop, and then also the parenting, the environment you are. Am I, again in some war-torn country? Am I in a country where there's relative peace? Those are going to impact you as far as how you see authority, how you see your ability to success. The two classic response patterns from the last century in the 60s and 70s, one was one called learned helplessness. And again, this came from experiments with dogs where you give them shocks that they can't escape from. And then later you put them into a new environment that they could easily walk away, but they don't because they've learned they can't escape. And so they just sit there and endure the shocks. Interestingly, though, if you teach them how to escape, they do. When they're in that learned helpless condition, they're depressed. They have all the sides of depression, but as soon as you teach them how to escape, then that changes that, right? Same thing with kids in foster. If they've been really beat down, if you can give them a success experience, that bodes them well down the road. Another one from that, and so education, that's a real big deal. Another one in education is something called locus of control. Do you see yourself as having control, or is control outside of you? So a person with an external locus of control who gets a raise will say, well, it just happened, probably had nobody better to promote than me. Whereas a person who has an internal locus of control would say, well, I work hard. I can see that they saw that I deserve the promotion. So, they see that they've had a role in playing. They have some control over the things that are going to happen to them. So those are kind of the two classic ones. I find that everybody has a set of core response patterns. Some are positive, some are negative, because they all have opposites, right? So the opposite of conflict is dangerous would be, I can manage conflict. I have some power in that. And that would be a person who would then be able to engage with others with conflict and do reasonable compromise and that sort of thing. The other big one that I would run into a lot is intimacy is dangerous. So if I grew up in an environment where every time I try to be close to my parents, they distance themselves or they're absent, then great pain, the circuit, again, this caring circuit, great pain gets associated with intimacy. Now, as an adult, I'm working with them and they tell me, I don't understand. Every time I try to get close, I do something to mess it up. And it's because those bells and whistles are going off, saying, danger, danger, you're getting close, danger, you're going to get hurt. And it's all on an unconscious level, right? Until the person can start to identify it. That one's interesting because when you look at people who come from dysfunctional backgrounds, all their friends come from dysfunctional backgrounds, right? Because we seek out people that have a similar response patterns to us. And so it begins to seem like the whole world is that way. And that's true for regardless of where you're at with positive or negative ones. I mean, all my friends have been married for a long time and, they have, healthy relationships, very different from somebody who comes from, very dysfunctional background. So what you have to do is in the case of intimacy, you have to desensitize to it, just as you would have to desensitize to a fear of water. And so what I would do with people, I say, okay, let's identify some of the characteristics of people who have healthy relationships and are comfortable with intimacy. Now, I want you to figure out a place where you can meet them. Maybe some people, they may know somebody at work, they may know somebody at church or a social organization they're at or whatever. I want you to hang around them and just start to go to coffee with them, do things with them. And of course, their number one complaint is these people are so boring. There is no excitement in their life at all. They're just so even keel. There's no drama in their life. So, but I'll encourage them, hang around them for 6 months. And at the end of 6 months, they usually find, this feels really good. I like this comfort, that this not up and down all the time, this kind of steadiness that they have, and being able to have appropriate disclosure and appropriate, intimacy with another person, it starts to feel really good. With people that I used to deal with panic attacks and panic disorder, one of the things I would do is I would give them a relaxation response program to listen to. And it was interesting how often just the feeling of being relaxed would make them anxious because it was so foreign to them, and so they would have to actually desensitize to what does it feel like to be relaxed. So again, different. So these are what I mean by core response patterns. We all have them. In my book, I have a whole bunch of, labels that I put. Intimacy is dangerous. The opposite would be intimacy is comfortable and desirable. I'm not okay. The opposite would be I am okay the way I am. I can't succeed. The opposite would be, I can succeed. I have the ability to, to take the steps I need to succeed. So we have a whole lot of these types of programs inside of ourselves, and oftentimes they're very individualized depending upon your personal experience. And just looking at your life and how you respond to stuff is how you start to identify what label I should put on it. Having a list like what's in my book kind of is helpful because you can go down it and say, oh yeah, this rings a bell, this rings a bell. Oh, this rings a bell, both on the positive and negative side. Excuse me. So those are core response patterns. So, and I should say how I change them, right? 4 steps. And I usually have people develop what I call a summary sheet. The first thing is, where did it come from? And that's usually not a big mysterious thing. In the case of conflicts is dangerous, I came from a life, from a childhood where, I had no closeness with my parents. And I have them make it like a one paragraph summary statement. Because again, circular why questioning, people start saying, I don't understand. Well, wait a minute. I know why. It's because of this. Next step is, where does it come up? Identifying specific places in your environment where it comes out, like with the conflict is dangerous. We already mentioned a few. When I'm out with a person, I let others make decisions for me. I don't speak up when I'm at work or whatever. And then you come up with, what are the opposite behaviors I can practice? So when I'm at work, I'm going to find some times where I can state my opinion. When I'm out with others, if I decide I really want to do something, I'm going to go ahead and practice doing it. And just as with desensitization, with fear of water or anything else, you start with the easy situations and you work up to the more difficult ones. And then on top of that, you come up with the cognitive side. What are some things I can tell myself that can help me motivate myself to do these new behaviors? And then those are the kind of the 4 areas you work in.
I love that. Well, I think that's really practical. And what I'm curious about is the application of using this to potentially people who have poor self-worth. I feel that comes up quite a bit. Like people have self-worth worth issues, or in sports, sometimes they'll self-sabotage. And
Right,
when I work with them, it's because of this old belief, right, that they're not good enough to be number one. And I
right,
know it's going to be some sort of memory there. Or like the idea that I've heard in sports is that it's like worthiness, but also your worldview, where many pro athletes will get a lot of money, but maybe they came from backgrounds where they were very, poor, right? So they
right,
get all this money, but they're able to kind of blow it all. And you
right.
think about, how did you blow all this millions of dollars? Because they didn't really have the consciousness to sustain like the worth of wealth. And how,
Mm.
does what you're sharing, does it help with any of those things? And could you give us an example?
Well, that's the cognitive side, and again, just being aware of, when I grew up, uh, I had no money and I didn't think I just, and I grew up with the mentality that I didn't deserve it. The reality is that I am worthy, and coming up with some statements that are meaningful for that person, because things that are meaningful to me may not be meaningful for another person, right? So you work with them and say, okay, let's talk about value and where does your value come from? A lot of times people will place their value on their performance, right? I'm only valuable if I do things that are valuable. Uh, so if I fail at a test, that makes me a failure. So I try to say, okay, if you have a friend who fails at something, do you look at them as a failure? Well, no. Why? And ultimately, you get down to the idea that they have some intrinsic value just inside of themselves. From a religious perspective, it's the idea that I'm made in the image of God, however you want to say that to yourself, right? And so that in itself puts some image, some value in me. Human life, people have value in and of themselves, that intrinsic, that has nothing to do with what they do. I mean, a baby is valuable, even though they're not doing anything, right? And so as you start to try to build that sense that I have some intrinsic value that has nothing to do with what I do in life or what's surrounding me, that's kind of where I come from with people. And once they buy into that and they come up with a way to say that to themselves in a way that's powerful for them, because again, what's powerful for what's powerful for you may not be powerful for me. So again, you have to kind of individualize this to yourself.
Amazing. I love that. And that's
Mhm.
goes hand in hand with some of the things that I've learned. So I'm glad that it kind of confirms that idea. And I'm
Mhm.
curious, like we touched on it a little bit, but like you have quote unquotes like the science of happiness. And
Mhm.
I think about like the science of enlightenment, or at least improving the mental, emotional state of your
Right.
day-to-day affairs, right? So if you're in constant stress, constant depression, right, this is a very low level of being. And is it Richard? Oh gosh, people are gonna kick my butt for this. Hawkins, I think it's
Mhm.
whatever the Hawkins map of consciousness. I forget his first name right now. I think it's maybe Richard, but he has this Hawkins map of consciousness, and what's low is like fear, anxiety, doubt, depression, worry, all these things, right? But then joy, happiness, fulfillment, or even contentment. And I feel like if most people could be in contentment and happiness and gratitude and
Mhm.
joy and curiosity 80-90% of the day, they're gonna have a much more fulfilling life. And I feel like if you just take stock each and every day at the end of your day, like, how was my emotional state throughout the day, right? And
Yeah.
so overall, I was give myself a 65 because I went up and down. And if
Mm.
you did that every single day, you kind of notice that it's just like, well, this went wrong because of this issue and that, and you realize over time those issues are not that big a deal. Like whether
Mm.
it's getting cut off in traffic or like a stressful deadline or some
Yeah.
coworker said something, if you can continue to analyze it, and then you can have a strategy moving forward,
Mm.
right? Where you either nip that emotion in the butt and you can come back and then retrain yourself. And this is something that I use with a lot of athletes, because we would have a lot of emotional triggers out there when something would happen on the field,
Mm.
right? Like in tennis, you mess up and the anger flares up. Well, we know that's going to happen. So
Mhm.
that's your first trigger of like coming back to the center. And that's when you use that cognitive process you shared, right? Combined with the emotional one and awareness,
Mhm.
coming back to the present moment, you
Mhm.
can perform at a lot better level. It doesn't work every time, but it certainly curbs it, right? And it gives you a more positive trajectory.
And I think for specific application like what you're using, that's right on. Let me say first that everybody's heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's upside down. First of all, it had no research that he came up with it, but it's been in the psychology textbooks for so long. You know, the thing that's most important to us is relationship. That's
Mm.
why people will sacrifice their life in a burning building, or warfare, or just, you'll do all kinds of stuff for that relationship need. That's really what's core for us. And when you look at these circuits we're talking about, that need for connection with people really is super important. And self-actualization is so far away from the things that make people happy. In fact, the three things that researchers come up with, and the positive psychology started about 2000. In 1999, the guy who was the head of the American Psychological Association said, we need to start studying what makes people happy and function well, because we've been so focused on dysfunction for the last century, right? And so 2000 is when the research kicked off, and now there's been a pretty good body of research. And the number one thing that makes people happy in life, relationship, healthy, positive relationships. The second thing is purpose, having a reason to get up in life, and purpose can be narrow or it can be broad. It may be just simply, I want to provide for, be the best mom I can be, or I want to be the best salesman I can be, or I want to be the best athlete I can be in my sport. And that's useful until it's over, right? And then you got to find a new purpose. And of course, you can have more than one purpose in life. So having something bigger than yourself is important as well. That's why so many people now are into, saving the earth and that type of stuff. It's because it gives them a sense of something bigger than themselves. The third one is meaning. This is the one that's hard to pin down because it interacts with purpose and it helps to drive purpose, but it's separate. And it has to do with answering the big questions of, why am I here? What is life all about? Is there something when I die, or am I just a little machine that when it stops working, that's the end? I like to point people to some of the research that's going on with near-death experiences. And I think it was in the 70s, Moody came up with his kind of groundbreaking book on life after life, where he talked about near-death experiences. And that kicked off a whole lot of research. I've got one very large research that was done that I quote in my book, where at the end they say, all these explanations, they talk about dying brain, chemical, they say none of that seems to hold in our research, because we're dealing with people where there's no brain activity, no heart, everything is completely flat, and yet they're talking about things that happen in the operating room, in the room next door, sometimes a mile away. Oftentimes, or not often, but many times, can be third-party verified. So something's going on. We don't know what it's about. So this idea that there's some aspect to us beyond just the physical, when you start thinking about it, that's something that in our culture and in the U.S. right now, we don't talk much about. We're a very materialistic society. We've done away with a lot of our spiritual thinking. But what you do with that, like we get into the area of spirituality, metaphysical, as you talked about, or religion, however you want to phrase it. I talk about it as your existential belief systems, to be neutral, your existence. What is my existence about? Because that's going to provide the framework for everything else, right? And coming up with some answers that are satisfying to you. And I think taking a look at some of this research and some of the stuff that's going on around, because people have been thinking about this ever since there've been people, and a lot of different answers have come up with that. Will help you to frame again your purpose. It will also help you with relationships, how you see them. Although, that idea of having some healthy relationships is very important. When you look at the two things that the Surgeon General has just pointed out in the last couple of months, the rapid increase in anxiety and depression among young people, you look at they don't have relationship, they don't have purpose, they don't have meaning. Is it any surprise of what we see going on in our society right now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It makes perfect sense. And I'm glad that you brought up those three. And I'm curious if you can share where you got the research from for the happiness indicators, because I love that. And I think it's so on point. And then when you talk about the near-death experiences, and if people are to look deeper, there's a lot out there. And I've had a few guests on that have had near-death experiences and have studied near-death experiences. And it's a very fascinating subject because it goes into the ideas of like, what do people experience or regret when they die, right? And it's like, oh, shoot, I wasted so much time on this. Could I go back in time? And if we can analyze that now, we're not going to waste a year or 10 years or potentially a whole life being like, what the heck was I doing way over here? I had no business doing that. And all I need to do is adjust this. And I bet you if they had the button to go back and retry, they would navigate things a little differently.
Well, and there's been a lot of wisdom throughout the centuries that give us the guidelines to that. When you get old, the things that are most important, there's a Jewish expression that I really like. I want 6 people carrying my casket that are not looking at the watch. Yeah, that's really what becomes important to people down the road is the lives you've touched. Accomplishments are important. I'm the fact that I've touched a lot of lives, and there are people that are doing better now than they were before they encountered me or in some of my work is very satisfying for me. But also just the relationships within my family and my community, and the impact I've had on others becomes very important. Even if you're in a field like sales or something, the fact if you people that I found, like a friend of mine who was in the furniture business. He was an amazing person. He was very much into servant management and just the impact he had on his company and the impact he had on people around him. I mean, he died of cancer just a few years back, but just even the way he went through that and the way he touched lives, how he navigated that phase of his life was really has touched me a lot. And those are the things I think make people happy if they can look at that and learn from that when they're younger. And again, that's not the way our culture is geared right now. Our culture is very much into, life is about getting what you want, enjoying life, having these peak experiences and stuff. And those are good. And I think it's important to have those, but that's not that contentment and that happiness that you mentioned early on that allows you to not always be at an even keel, but when things come up and you go through those waves, you're able to ride over them and come back down into that level, that sense of comfort. For me, it's not a matter of not experiencing, but a matter of having joy in my life. Joy and not that ecstatic type of thing, but that kind of constant joy of just being happy, being able to get with people and enjoy that. That for me is the ultimate.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I've been very fortunate in my life to kind of design it through my early 20s and into my 30s, where I could have all of these quote unquote peak experiences, travel to 25 countries, study with all the people I wanted, the whole thing. I got to do everything that I could imagine. And it was all wonderful and beautiful for that time. And now that I've gotten older, I see the value in relationships in which a lot of the new agey stuff or all that kind of stuff that's out there, they don't really put a lot of value on relationships and family. But that's going to be the one that's sustained over time, that when you get older, you're like, holy smokes, like this was the thing all along. So I could have done what I've done, but also had more reverence and respect for the beauty and possibility of family, because now that I'm in that phase of my life, I'm so grateful for it. And I'm going to have more incredible experiences, but now I have this other category that I
Mm.
didn't give enough reverence or respect to. And I feel like many people didn't. If you could just have a beautiful family, you're going to have more happiness and fulfillment than most people, I think, you know what I mean? And making sure that you have a high quality of relationship with your spouse, with your kids, you know, with your inner circle, whatever the
Mm.
case that is, right? As you then ideally move into the other things you're speaking about, meaning
Right.
and purpose and right livelihood. And now you're really working in synergy with things that really light you up, right? Your life and as a whole, as you look at it and analyze it, you have a power as a creator
Mm-hmm.
to change things, to influence things, to improve things, to modify things as you go through the experience. And it's just very important that we understand our values, right? What's going to be the best bang for a buck, right? So
Right.
everybody knows when you get infinite money, not everybody knows, but maybe on this podcast, get all the money, right? Then you drive the Bentley we'll just use my example. I drive the Bentley to the best snowboard place, right? I go heliborn, but I'm meeting all these people for the first time, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And then maybe you get all the ladies and you get all the booze and you get all the thing. Well, you run that pattern for maximum 6 months, you're going to be jealous, right? And it's not going to have that
I don't know
fulfillment.
that there's that 1 millionaire. They ask him, so how much is enough? He said always just a little more.
Yeah, right. But if you do that all alone, like, you know, I'd love to go
Yeah.
hitchhike into the mountains with one good buddy, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And have that experience with that friend, because that value and that beauty and that experience is so far on like the maximum materialism level, you know what I mean?
And when I talk about relationship, it's not necessarily just family too. You know, men and women used to have lots of types of connections. You know, you had men had their hunting group or their, you had the Elks Club or whatever, and we don't have stuff like that anymore. At least wise, there's not a lot of it. It's still out there. Uh, so finding community where you can have those deep relationships, having three people that you can say whatever you want to with them and they'll accept you. If you have three people like that in your life, you won't need a therapist. Your mental health is going to be okay. And most people don't even have one.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And especially with the
Mhm.
kids. And I can see that I'm at the age group where I am aware of the old organizations and the groups of the people. And you'd even call them, there's so many men's groups now because those organizations were there before, but now they
Yeah.
don't exist.
Yeah.
Right. So now we have this gaping hole where people are filling them with men's groups or with these different things to build the community. It's same with church, like I have my own beef with certain religions and things like that, but I think it's
Mhm.
good. And one of the things that I learned from David Lombert is that he said church is community, right? So you had back in the day, many more people, even if you didn't believe everything that was going on, or you did, it doesn't matter. You
Mhm.
had that power of community. And that is so beautiful and
Yeah.
so important,
Yeah.
right? Especially when we go through challenging times. And as the cycle of the world goes, we look out and we're in some challenging times and we
Yeah.
might have a few more. And it's so much easier to navigate if you have some community. You're going to feel more safe. You're going to feel more secure. You're going to have better relationships. So wherever that community comes from, I think it's important for us to analyze. And I'd be curious on the metaphysical front, because you did talk about the near death, right? And so these
Mhm.
experiences are showing, and it's been my experience through meditation and through other very
Mhm.
mystical experiences that I've had, that there's something way greater than we can perceive. It's so
Right.
great. It's so vast. It's so wonderful. It's so unknowable.
Mhm.
But consciousness is not local. It can go to different spots. And I know of people who've had spontaneous healings, for example, whether they came on the podcast or even Dr. Joe Dispenza's work. When he talked about people, he put the EEG on them, and then the people would say they had this crazy experience and they can measure it, and
Mhm.
then all of a sudden the next doctor checkup, something was gone. Now, this isn't going to happen for everyone. These
Mhm.
are these extraordinary experiences,
Mhm.
but there are people that it's repeated. It's not just one case of one person. It's like many. So it's like, what's the formula to have this mystical experience? That doesn't make any sense. And so for me, the practical curiosity is sports performance, right? I wanted to
Mhm.
do a double backflip. So I can't do one now. I'm working on it, but somebody who can do that can go ahead, go in my body, land a double backflip like you. I could go switch consciousness. I know what it feels like, so I can go and perform that trick. And in
I don't know
visualization,
at my age, I don't know.
if you could stand up and we're good. If you could stand up and down to a squat, we're good. I'll land it. No problem. There's a jump and a transition. We got this. It's gonna be
Uh,
okay. So because I know the feeling I can go perform it. And part of the training is to visualize it, is to come, into alignment with that thing, that feeling. And I'm curious with your work, whether it's like, even just the feeling more contentment and happiness, because some people work towards that and some people just have it naturally. They have a more happy demeanor, but we know through neuroplasticity, we can change that. And I'm curious if you've brushed on like the limits where people are like, oh, I manifested this through visualization, or where that balance is, because we do live in a very mysterious realm. And I feel like when I coach anything around that realm now, it's like you need to know what you're going for, because you have to work equally hard. So in sports, for example, they do all the physical training and they do the diet, but they don't do a lot of the meditation or the visualization or the sports psychology work, which is so important. And when you combine the two, that's when you get the miraculous, the impossible experiences. And the last way I'll put it is like training with the Shaolin monks. One of the teachers could break stone with 2 fingers, which is freaking impossible, but he could do it. And he could break other things with elbows and knees, because he did the hard training of conditioning his body by punching and kicking friggin' trees, but then also visualizing over and over through decades. Then we see it and say, wow, this is miraculous. So if we could line that up with our meaning, with our purpose, with our relationships, with what's most important in our life, work hard throughout the day, and then add that visualization piece, that metaphysical piece, I feel like we're really firing on all cylinders to influence our reality in the greatest way possible. And if we can do it with non-attachment, that's a very powerful way to navigate existence.
Wow, that's a lot.
What do you think of that?
I'm not sure where to go with all that. I know it is interesting how there are times when you have to just trust that your body and your being can do something. A very simple example would be typing. I used to. For a while, and one of the things that they had me doing when I was teaching in college is when they needed to fill up another class, I would do keyboarding, and to get kids just to trust that their body could do it, and not look at their fingers all the time. In fact, you'd have to put paper over their fingers so that they would look at it. And I say,
that was my typing. But
and the same thing with I think with a lot of physical things that we do. Is just understanding that it's like dancing, right? If you look at your feet, you're never going to dance. At some point in time, you got to get carried away with the music and let your body just move into what they call the flow, right? And so many things in life are like that. Once you let go of trying to manage it consciously, so I mean, again, you do the training, you do all that other type of stuff, but there comes a point in time where you just have to trust that ability is there and it'll go. And that's a hard thing to do for a lot of people, is to let go. And again, I think your peak performers, that's something that they've mastered, is they're no longer trying to micromanage the performance, right? They're into the flow of the performance. I know I play guitar, and in fact, we got a nice gig coming up for the 4th. But when it works best is when I'm thinking about it. And it's kind of like you're riding the wave, and that music is going on and you're just kind of riding it, and you're just kind of like driving a car or something, you're not thinking too much about what you're doing. You're just doing it. And it's hard to get to that point. And I think that's part of in different things where people are really into mastery. That's part of where they've gotten to, is they've done the basic work, but now they're to the point where they're detaching from micromanaging the process of doing whatever it is that they're doing, and they're just kind of moving into the flow, and they're looking at where they're going. And I think that's an important point too. I know a lot of sports, that's what you're doing, is you're looking at where you want to go as opposed to thinking about how you're getting there. And you're just trusting that your training is going to allow you to get to that point. So I'm just going to focus on where I'm going, and then trust that body's going. I'm sure you've done that with people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the simplest one that comes to mind is snowboarding through trees. Always telling the kids, don't look at the trees, because you're going to ding the trees. Look at the space between the trees where you want to go. And that analogy, you summed it up very well. I totally agree. Another way that you would see that is through martial arts. I can do the training, practice the kicks, and when I'm in there, the idea is to let those techniques and everything flow and be in the moment, because you have no idea what's going to happen, because it's an organic experience. And this kind of goes back to what we said before, is like experience being the most important thing. So do your education, do your practice, do your learning. And that's why I'm big on the visualization, because it's a space of simulation that we can go to train the body. And we have a lot of evidence that shows like it can change the neurocircuitry circuitry. Like when they hooked up sprinters, right? The same part of their brain would fire sprinting when not sprinting, right? And so we know, neural pruning and neuroplasticity is very interesting. But then we can also, again, use all of this to just go back to like what states of being we want to be in, and then apply all those other things, right? Where's the focus? Because in law of attraction, studying something like that is always like, it's always about money, right? It's like, I want the money. It's like, okay, great. Money is good because, but what do you want? Like, what is the thing that you want? And there's infinite ways to get the thing that you truly want, right? Than just having a pile of money, right? That's not exactly what you want, because a pile of money is not going to do you any good if you're, by yourself nowhere in the middle of the Himalayas with no friends. It's just like, it's like, okay, now what, right? It's like, what did you actually want?
Yeah, money is just a tool, like any other tool. It buys you time and energy in different forms, but and you think about it that way, then because I lived in Japan for 2 years after I got married. I went over there and taught, and that was an interesting experience because everything was in yen, right? And for me, it was like play money. I got 3,000 yen every month, and so I have a pile of money, and we would say, okay, this is for groceries, this is for this and that. But it kind of really changed my thought about how that works.
Yeah, I remember being in Bali, and I can't remember what the conversion is, but I was taking out like 2 million, whatever
Oh,
the money
yeah,
was. And
yeah,
I was
yeah.
like, oh yeah, it's like, do you want 1.5 or 2 million? It's like, this is the
Yep,
best.
yep.
I was like, holy smokes, like what a fun thing. But yeah, it's very, very fascinating.
Yeah, my goal was to earn 3 million by the time I was 30, and I said, well, next 3 million I'd like to be in dollars. So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been amazing. I really appreciate this. Very practical, I think very helpful. Is there anything that you wish that we had talked about or we should discuss before we close the show?
oh, we covered a lot of more ground than people could probably absorb at this point in time.
Awesome. And so where can people find your work if they want to get your book, if they want to dive deeper? And you have many books and a lot of work out there. So if they want to follow you and get in touch, where should they go?
Easiest place is my website, whyemotions.com. So whyemotions.com, and that takes you to where my YouTube videos are. It takes you over to where the book links are, and it's in audio and ebook as well as paperback. So you get a variety of formats for things.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. This has been real fun, so I appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, thanks.